Wow, that is, be ready to sing that again at the end. That's beautiful, beautiful. Wonderful. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Romans, the 9th chapter, 18 through the rest of the chapter. We're going to do quite a little bit of reading this morning. But we'll still let you out in time. Lord's will, nothing happens anyway. And hopefully something happens. But this evening, I want to say again on that, I've got some printouts for you this evening. And God says Jerusalem is holy. Everything we look at is unholy. So what's God talking about? Well, we're going to get into that and look at the spiritual. And this is what God's been dealing with me a lot in the last few weeks, is the spiritual part of us and the physical part of us. And we've got to make sure that the spirit man has the right connection and is in control. And then the physical man will be taken care of. But it's the spiritual man that gets the revelations and the insights and the future. But I want us to take a look today at the physical side of certain things, and then also the spiritual side in the context that we're going to go into here in Romans. This is throughout the Bible. Galatians is very heavy in some of this, and Peter also in 1 Peter talks about this. But let's just narrow it down here, condense it down so we can take a good look. We're going to talk about being chosen of God. To be chosen is to be special. How many believes that?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And to be chosen by God is the most special of all. When I was in the first grade in Osage, Oklahoma, I was thrilled in going to school. And that Christmas season, I really liked the teacher I had, even though she's a little old. She's probably in her 40s, and what have you. But the teacher asked us one day, she said, I'm going to put something up so that it'll be shown to the other kids coming from ours. Had a picture of Santa Claus. Now, just his facial, neck up. You can draw it, create it, or you can copy it, whatever. Well, being I needed something to outline it, I outlined it. And took a lot of effort doing that even. Boy, but I was kind of proud. The teacher took all of these pictures that we had drawn, each child, and mine was chosen to represent our class. Now, Dan, I thought that I had just died and went to heaven. Chosen. It was a big deal. I was telling everybody how big a deal it was. That my, it was just a copy. It was just a picture. And yet, I remember to this day how I felt being chosen. Wow, that made me feel special. Now, there's been a lot of times I wasn't chosen. But this one incident starting in my life, I had been chosen, so I know how special it is. So I want us to understand, if we can, how special it is to be chosen, not just a personage, but as a unit, a people. So listen to what Paul has to say. Now, nobody was any more Hebrew than the Apostle Paul, Hebrew of the Hebrews. But he gives us this here, and this evening, if you are here, we're going to break down the physical from the spiritual and take a look at God's covenant with Jerusalem. But here's what Paul says, starting in at the 23rd verse, 9th chapter of Romans. Now what he's doing, he's speaking to the Jewish people. There are Gentiles there, but he's really speaking to the Jewish people. In fact, he's telling them how painful it is to acknowledge the fact that the Jewish people are losing out on the things that God had prepared for them. In fact, he even said, I wished I was accursed for your sake. That's a terrible place. They had accused him of being a traitor. But now then, he lets them know why that he has given this truth. And that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy. He's just given a dialogue on God's choice. God has chosen the Gentiles here. And so he's given a dialogue on this, and I'm going to explain this a little more in detail in just a minute. But that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy. We are the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory. See, the Israelites were supposed to, through being chosen of God, to elevate God and honor God to the point that the other nations of the world would know how great God was. But they become introverted with God. God wasn't pleased with that. Even us. Now he's talking about himself and the Jewish people. Even us whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. Now he's getting to the core of this here, that God has not just called the Jewish people. He did call them. And he called them to be the light of the world, but they failed in that. And so now he said, not just the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. As he said also in Hosea, it's Hosea 2:23, we'll call them my people. Now listen to what he said. Paul is saying, listen folks, and he's speaking to the Jewish folks, you can go back to the Old Testament. And he talks about Isaiah also. You can go back to Hosea. You can go back to the Old Testament. I will call them my people and her beloved, speaking of the church, which was not beloved. They were not the chosen at that time. But the Old Testament prophesies that they will be called. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there shall they be called the children of the living God. Now we got to understand, the Israelite people were called as God's chosen people. The Gentiles were not under that covenant. But Paul is saying, he's going to give us the reason for this in a few minutes. But Paul is saying, but God now has chosen those that were not chosen. But now they're chosen. Isaiah also crieth concerning Israel. Isaiah talks about it. Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. Now what he's saying here is that God is turning to the Gentiles. He's choosing them, but listen, Israel, you're not totally left out. God has a remnant for you. This is all recorded in the Old Testament, is what he's saying. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness. He's talking about our day and time right now. Because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. God is putting his bride together. He's calling his bride together. The remnant, and we'll explain some of that in the Jerusalem courses that we're going to be teaching. But he's underlining the word righteousness. And then God said, I'll make a short work, and I'll make it upon the earth. And Isaiah, he goes back to the Old Testament, Paul does. And as Isaiah said before, except the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a seed. Now he's talking again of the remnant of Israel. We had been as Sodom and been like unto Gomorrah. But he's saying, I want you Jewish folks to know, God still has a remnant. He hasn't totally forsaken you. But what shall we say then? What are we going to say then? That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, have attained to righteousness? You mean those heathens that were not right? Now they're right? Even the righteousness which is of faith, two words we're going to look at in here, faith and righteousness. You see, the Jewish people were asking Paul if God had broken his promise with them. Has God broken his promise with us? Paul was being accused of being a traitor. So here he protests his deep feelings about his people, just like we would about our own family members. And then he tells us prior to this, you see, they were saying, God chose us, God can't break that promise. In other words, they're saying, we have choices to reject God, but God doesn't have any choices. But if you read the first part of this chapter, you'll find out that Paul is saying, oh yes, God does have choices. The potter that makes the vessel has the choice of making it good or bad. Read that part and you'll understand it a little better. God still has choices also. It is your problem and your fault, not God's. God wanted to be a God to the world and use you as a chosen vessel but you failed in that attempt. And Paul is saying, God decides, not me. You've rejected God. God's the one that made this decision, not me. I know you're going to hear a lot that the Jewish people are still God's holy people, but they're not holy people. There's a remnant that are coming through them. God is going to keep His word. But God is going to make up a chosen people. He makes that choice. And He explains that God made the choice from Jacob to Esau. Well, that's not fair. Well, read that in the earlier part of this chapter. God decides on who He will have choice or mercy, not you and me. And so Paul, a Hebrew, is telling these Jewish folks, you need righteousness and you need faith. And if you don't have that, then you're not a part of the chosen of God. Then he goes and says, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness have attained unto righteousness? Are you saying that these heathen are now choosing to be right with God? God's choosing them? Why? Wherefore? Why? And then Paul explains it. Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. What he's saying is the reason that God moved from you to the Gentiles is because you had no more faith. It were by the works of the law. It became ritualistic. It became the law. The law became your standard. The law became your salvation. The law became your righteousness. The rituals became all of these things that connect us to God. And Paul is saying, no. It is faith that makes us related to God. It is faith that gets us the connection to God. It is faith that God chooses to walk with us. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. In other words, he's saying why the reason they didn't recognize Jesus Christ when He came was because they were too wrapped up in the elements of tangibility or the law and rituals that they had lost their faith and righteousness in God. And so God said, lo, I turn to the Gentiles. Wherefore? Why did this happen? They're asking that. Can you imagine that? Kind of dumbfounded. Why did God choose these heathen folks over us when we are the special people? Paul said, well, because you lost your faith in Him. You lost your trust in God. So you're not right with God anymore. You look to the law. You look to the works of the law. And then he said, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on Him shall not be ashamed. So what is he saying? Paul's saying, God sent His Son down here, and instead of receiving Him, God sent Him to you. The Bible clarifies that. That Jesus came to His own, and His own received Him not. Jesus didn't come to the Gentiles, basically. He came, now He opened the door for that, but He came basically to the Jewish people, but they did not receive Him. They became a stumbling block. They stumbled over it. He came to save them. He came as the Son of God. And they did not recognize Him because everything they did was not in faith or righteousness, but in works. And when our life is built upon works, and is built upon tangible things, we better have a connection in the Spirit, because our physical body can do that. Now, our physical body cannot be spiritual. It can be brought under subjection, but it cannot be spiritual. When you look at Dan over here, you're going to look at a fleshly guy, and you're going to see in the tangible part, you're going to see a body that is not spiritual. But there is a spiritual being there. One who is right with God. But God sees it, and we see it through the Spirit, but in the tangible eyes that we have, we cannot see but a physical body.
You're right.
And so Paul is trying to explain this to them. There's a spiritual part and there's a physical part. Remember what he said, whosoever believeth on Him shall not be ashamed. The stumbling block, if we would believe on Him, if we would trust Him. But they trusted the temple. They trusted everything else. But when Jesus came, they were embarrassed because they could not believe on Him, because they tried to look at everything in the physical sense. Now, folks, God's wrapping this term that we live in right now. Our lifespan is being wrapped up. We need to know these things.
Right.
And we need to understand them.
Absolutely.
Man chooses according to the tangible or the physical aspect. Man wants to worship God, but remember what Jesus said to the woman at the well? She said, where do I worship? Where do I go to worship? The Jews, you folks say down in Jerusalem at the temple, and the Samaritans, the half-Jews here, are saying that we go over here at this mount. Tangible. I want something tangible. Where do I go to worship God? I want something tangible. But you know what Jesus said? He said, they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. He said neither one of these places are of any importance without the spiritual worship.
That's right.
They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth.
Right.
People think, well, I worship the Lord by the way I dress. I worship the Lord by the way I dance around. Well, if you get emotional, that's fine. And if things excite you, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with saying amen now and then. Nothing wrong with getting a little excited now and then. But some folks try to get excited and think that's spiritual. No, the Spirit ought to be in operation at all times.
Oh, you're right.
Now listen to what he said.
Makes sense.
See, man chooses, when he chooses something or someone, he chooses according to the tangible or the physical, the abilities, the skills, the talents, looks, etc. All these things are important in making a choice in man's viewpoint. But God chooses according to the heart. God looks at the spiritual aspect of a man when He chooses him. In Romans here, Paul is separating the spiritual from the physical. Human bloodlines are temporary.
Mhm.
They were so important to the Jewish people. But bloodlines to God are very temporal. Spirit is eternal. Paul and Luke are brethren. Think about this. Paul and Luke are comrades. Paul and Luke travel together. Luke, a physician, Paul, the evangelist here, they travel together and they preach together and they love the Lord together. But one is a Jew and the other is a Gentile. So it's not the bloodline. It's a spiritual connection that we have with each other and we have with God. Abraham was justified by faith. And that hadn't changed, folks. The just shall live by faith. The law can never impart righteousness. Only Jesus can do that. He is the only source to make us right with the Father.
You're right.
No one else can do that. The law has nothing more to say to the believer. We're going to read that in just a minute. You see, the Gentiles, by God's choice, have been moved to a place of privilege, are chosen. We are chosen of God.
Right.
That ought to make us feel excited. We are chosen of God.
Yes.
Not to be introverts and say, okay, we're the only ones chosen of God. You're out there, I'm in here. No, this is not just you and I. It's everyone that God calls. Doesn't matter if they speak Chinese. Doesn't matter if they speak Korean. Doesn't matter if they speak Spanish, English, whatever. That's God's choice.
That's right.
And God's going to bring together people of all kinds of nationalities and bring them together into one body because He chooses to do that.
That's right.
Yes. You're right.
And this is what was kind of hard to understand. But we've been chosen. I've been chosen. You've been chosen. Chosen for what? To be introverted? No, chosen to be extroverted. Take the message out. Let everybody know that Jesus loves them. Jesus cares about them. So we've been moved to a place of privilege. Even the Old Testament speaks of this, and this shouldn't have been a surprise to the Jewish people that Paul was addressing. Now, Paul sums this up. Just follow down through, start first verse in the 10th chapter of Romans. Just go right on down. He said, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved." I really pray that they might be saved. "For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God." They do all these rituals, and they got the temple, and they do all of these things, but not according to knowledge. Now he's getting ready to say something here that I want us to emphasize even in our day and time that we live. Not just the Jewish people that had rejected the Lord and then blamed the Lord for not being with them. He said, "I bear them record they have a zeal of God." Now he's not saying they don't do the works of God. They have a zeal of God. They'll do all of these things. Keep all of these holidays. But not according to knowledge. But he said, they don't really understand. Because listen, he's making it clear in the next verse. For they being ignorant. They don't know. They have no knowledge. If you have no knowledge, the only basis that you have left is you're ignorant. For they being ignorant of God's righteousness. Now what are they ignorant of? What lack of knowledge do they have of God's righteousness? And going about to establish their own righteousness, they have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Now let's take a look at this here, because there are a lot of folks. Now we got some wonderful Christian folks right here in Clovis.
Oh, sure.
Worship is going on. Brothers and sisters that I don't even know, you don't even know, but they're right with God. And if they're right with God, they're Christian brothers, that they've been chosen of God. Remember Jesus said, you didn't choose me, I chose you. Chosen of God. We are privileged people. We're chosen of God in these last days. But there are a lot of folks today too that have no knowledge, and they're ignorant of the righteousness of God. And what do? They go about establishing their own righteousness. And when they do that, they are not able to submit themselves unto the righteousness of God. That's what Paul is saying. He's made it very clear. Paul didn't hold anything back. He said, when you go about to establish your own righteousness, or what is right with God, we need to ask God what's right. Well, I think that's right. I've talked to people. Well, I don't know about that. I think that's right. Well, shouldn't you know what's right or wrong? Jesus is always right. Let's submit to Him and His righteousness. Now listen, he clears this up. For Christ, the 4th verse, and that's as far as we're going. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. When we put our belief, our faith in Jesus Christ, it ends the law. You say the law's not important? Sure, the law is important. It brings us to, it defines what sin is. But it could never do anything about the sin problem. It could only point at it. It was a condemner. But now then, the law has become spiritual, and we do what we do faithfully and right with the Lord because we love Him. And when we love Him, we do His commandments. It doesn't matter whether you do His commandments or not. If you're going to follow the law, then you're judged by the law. And that's the works. And the works don't work. But isn't it wonderful to know that we've been chosen of God? I don't want to be ignorant, do you? But yet we have a lot of folks that, well, I'm not interested in understanding the Bible. I'm not interested in knowing anymore. I'm not interested in praying. I'm not interested in these things. Well, the only thing left then is ignorance. Then we become ignorant. And this is what happened to the Jewish people on the Israelite, is they became ignorant of what God desired from them. And now they're crying tears of rejection because God says, well, there will be a remnant. And we're going to take a little time in Jerusalem and talk about that in the last days, what's going to happen. But there will be a remnant, but right now, God has moved to the Gentiles. We are chosen. And we don't work through the rituals or the law. We work through the righteousness of Jesus Christ.
That's right.
And we follow Him. What are His commandments? Well, Jesus put 2 at the top. to love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is like unto it, to love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two hang all the law and the prophet. They're just hanging out there because these are the ones that are superior. Jesus came to love you and I. And we are to be right with Him when we begin to take our faith that God gave us, our measure of faith, and put it in Him, believe Him. We don't have to be ignorant, folks. Everyone can have a Bible. I probably got 10 Bibles. Everyone can have a Bible. Everyone can pray. Everyone can be faithful at church. Everyone can follow what the Lord, well, Lord, what do you want me to do? Just be faithful in what His Word says.
That's true.
But you know, a lot of people say, well, I didn't know that. Well, when we stand before God, ignorance is not going to be an excuse, because Paul's already saying, anybody that stands before God, even though God chose the children of Israel, ignorance is no excuse. They desired to be ignorant. They wanted to be ignorant. Why? They exchanged it for the tangible when we should be walking in the Spirit. Now, this may not be something that some understand altogether. Let me read one other deal here, and then this is pretty deep, and it's difficult for some people to grasp. But I want to go to Galatians 3:24 through 29. And if anybody's got that, go ahead and read it. I told you I was going to let you out, but I'm going to hold you just a second here.
You want 3:24 through 29?
24 through 29.
Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. For ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ,
That's a spiritual baptism, not just the water.
have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be in Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise.
You see, doesn't matter who we are. The promise was made to you and I too, as long as it's through faith, brings us to the righteousness of God. Isn't that wonderful to know that the law was our schoolmaster, but once, and work was to do, its job was to bring us to Christ. But with some, it didn't bring them to Christ. It just left them hanging out there. Christ was a stumbling block. But when it brings one to Christ, then we no longer need it. We need Christ because our spiritual man is superior to our physical man. Our spiritual man is eternal. Our physical man is temporary.
That's right.
And some didn't quite understand this, but it was to their fallacy. I'd like to have that song. We'll think about this. Folks, I know this is kind of hard to take, and it's going to be even a little heavy tonight. But you know, we don't want to leave here ignorant, do we? We want to grasp everything that we can.